I've been somewhat following the crisis in Nepal, and I've just watched a report by Cordelia Lynch of Sky News. It's the best I've seen so far, in the sense that it's the most comprehensive, and I will put a link on the video. Um, there seems to me to be strong echoes here of what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022 and Bangladesh in 2024, where you have a situation of widespread anger over corruption and then initially peaceful protests that turned violent and forced change in government. There's similarities, but there's also differences. No two situations are exactly alike. But this does seem to be something that's sweeping South Asia, and one wonders what country is going to be next. I mean, could it happen in India? India, of course, is a lot bigger, so I don't think it would be that. I think in the case of India, it would be more prolonged. If there was trouble, it would be more prolonged. And I think it's less likely there myself. I just can't really see it happening in India. I'm just going to read out the intro piece from Wikipedia on this situation. The 2025 Nepalese Gen Z protests. I'm saying Z, I'm not using the American Z. In September 2025, large-scale protests and demonstrations took place across Nepal, predominantly organised by Generation Z students and young citizens. Also known as the Gen Z protests, they began following a nationwide ban on numerous social media platforms, and they incorporated the public's frustration with corruption and displays of wealth by government officials and their families, as well as allegations of mismanagement of public funds. I'll just interject here. I know that a lot of the young Nepalese who have been interviewed, insist that it's not about the social media ban. Rather, that's been a trigger for the anger and the violence, or the unrest, I should say. But that in itself is not the main thing. This isn't just a case of people going out and rioting on the streets of Kathmandu because TikTok and so on have been banned. It's part of a wider, deeper problem. The movement expanded to encompass broader issues of governance, transparency, and political accountability. The protests escalated with violence against public officials and vandalism of government and political buildings taking place throughout the country. On the 9th of September 2025, former King Gyanendra Shah called for calm and resolution to be found internally. On that same day, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, along with a few government ministers, resigned. On the 12th of September 2025, Sushila Karki was appointed as interim Prime Minister of Nepal. By the 13th of September 2025, the protests had died down. It's now the 16th of September, and so far it doesn't look like there's any more major violence. But Nepal's an average sized country, 30 million people. 72 killed, that's 59 protesters, 10 prisoners, and 3 police officers. 1,300 injured. The Sky report had one guy injured by rubber bullets, excuse me. It's a misconception that rubber bullets are harmless. They certainly aren't. They can kill people. So initially the protests in Kathmandu were peaceful, but they turned violent, and I think that the government crackdown didn't help. There was a massacre, let's call it what it is, a massacre. In Kathmandu, initially 19 protesters shot dead. I mean, this is what you see in totalitarian states. But it has to be said, there's also been violence coming from protesters, and in the Sky News report, I know that there's protesters who were keen to stress that they didn't want to see violence, but there have been some ugly things, and I think this is why the question has to be asked, what happens next? Because it's all right venting rage, and that rage is understandable. I mean, outsiders shouldn't judge the protesters too harshly, because when you look at the sort of extravagant lifestyles that these corrupt ministers and their families have been guilty of, the so-called Nepo babies, it's very understandable why there's anger when Nepal, like a lot of countries in South Asia, deals with significant poverty. So those of us on the outside shouldn't be too judgmental. Any anger that we see in Britain is minuscule compared to the sort of anger in countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And no doubt it will happen elsewhere. In fact, in Kenya this year, there have been similar protests against the government of William Ruto. And in the case of Kenya, that was also deadly, 65 people killed. This time it's Nepal. But it's kind of revolutionary like scenes. You see government ministers' homes being burned. One particularly ugly incident, I mentioned the atrocity of protesters being gunned down. That is pretty horrendous, but the violence has happened both ways. There's a video going around, I watched it earlier, by the ex Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Duba and his wife were attacked. Now, these are elderly people, unarmed, and they were badly beaten up. You had an elderly woman punched in the face. Now, outsiders aren't going to look at that and say, oh, it's against corruption. They're going to say that's just thuggery. So the protesters, to be fair, they did call for it to be peaceful. And it probably is the case, as is always the case with these things, that there were some forces hijacked it that were not part of the main Gen Z protests. But there's no doubt there was real anger. And I saw footage, for example, of one young man in a green t-shirt being thrown back by water cannon. Those things aren't toys. But that footage, I must say, that sort of thing is also disturbing. I think no matter how deep the anger is, you need to be aware of outside perceptions. It's a little bit like a Hong Kong protest. Now, I was very, very sympathetic to the young Hong Kongers protesting because they did not want to become yet another communist city in China. But some of the antics were not very sensible. There was violence from some protesters, and it's true that they faced a lot of violence. There was sexual assaults on female protesters, but some of the things they were doing was not particularly helpful either. I've always said this: protesters need to be responsible. Now, how do you deal responsibly when you're met with brute force? Anger is totally understandable. But the thing is, just burning government buildings, burning homes, etc. The question needs to be what happens next. I mean, this interim Prime Minister, she's just going to be interim. So that's, she's going to have a work cut out for her dealing with this transition, whoever is to take over in Nepal. I think there needs to be some sort of government commission to extensively crack down on corruption, because that is a trigger for the anger. There needs to be, for example, laws brought in about how much extravagance ministers can dish out on. About the whole term Nepo baby is about nepotism. The son or daughter of a minister shouldn't be getting lavish lifestyles just because of their family connections. That's the sort of thing that does anger people. My girlfriend has mentioned this in the Philippines, and so far in the Philippines it hasn't spilled over into widespread anger, but that's not impossible, it's not inconceivable. In the case of the Philippines, like I say, each country has a unique situation. In the case of the Philippines, it's specifically about flood control projects. I'm just going to read out the article on that. Since 2024, a series of allegations of corruption, mismanagement and irregularities in government-funded flood control projects have been occurring in the Philippines under the administration of President Bongbong Marcos. The controversy centres on billions of pesos allocated for flood management initiatives, reports of ghost projects, substandard construction and the alleged cornering of contracts by a small number of favoured contractors. And let's not forget President Marcos's father and his mother were infamously corrupt. I mean, Imelda Marcos was spending vast amounts of money on lavish lifestyle on her famous shoe collection whilst people were facing crippling poverty. They bankrupted the Philippines. I mean, I'm an outsider and I have to, be careful not to say like I'm dictating how people should vote, but there was a lot of misinformation in the last Philippine presidential election. And in that situation, Marcos absolutely exonerated his father's record, and he didn't bother showing up to presidential debates. I know that because I watched them. So what does that tell you? I think he's more moderate than his father. He's not a dictator, but he has tried to whitewash his family's history. And, Filipinos who live through that, I wonder how they feel about that. He also has a lot of supporters. And there is a component in Philippine society that's very right-wing. And, for example, when Duterte was indicted for crimes against humanity with his drug war, because a lot of innocent people were killed in that, I'm not talking about drug lords, I'm talking about innocent people. there was a very vocal group of Duterte supporters were railing against International Criminal Court, whereas other Filipinos welcomed it and said no one should be above the law, including Duterte. As it stands, I don't see the sort of anger in the Philippines against Marcos as caused the People Power Revolution in 1986. But this sort of corruption could spill over. It could lead to the sort of anger that has happened in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. I might talk to my girlfriend about that actually, see her thoughts on it. She's not as political as I am, but I know that she does have views on this issue. Um, so, even I recall seeing a report in Equatorial Guinea, which had one of Africa's worst dictators, and that's another example of a country that's absolutely riddled with corruption. And again, this sort of lavish lifestyle on the elites. I mean, that's one thing I would point out in Britain. For all the anger that's out there, the United Kingdom rally and all the rest of it, Keir Starmer and David Lammy and Yvette Cooper, etc., they are not living in golden palaces. There isn't that sort of issue going on in this country. The most we have is Angela Rayner making some errors on her paperwork, and she's been held to account for it. She had to resign. So that's why I have a problem with people getting into hyperbole into what's happening in the UK. This is minuscule compared to other parts of the world. I'm not saying we should be complacent, and I'm not saying there's not legitimate anger in this country, but the reason I mention that is I saw people in the UK welcoming the violence in Kathmandu. Now, I understand, or I can try to understand the anger of the protesters there, but it's not the same situation at all. Anything we see in this country is minuscule compared to the problems of corruption faced in other parts of the world. And I would say in this country, because we have an open media, because we have opposition parties, there is the means there to hold it to account. But I'm not complacent. I mean, there is real anger in this country against our judicial establishment. I'm angry about that. I'm not about to go out and burn cars, but I do insist that judges need to be a hell of a lot more accountable, for example, when they make the decisions they make. But I'm just saying this to put things in context. The UK really isn't the worst place in the world to live. So anyway, I'll leave it there. But it makes, I think, across South Asia and in fact across the world, quite frankly, governments need to be on notice. If you polarize people enough, if you don't deal with corruption, if you allow this thing to fester, then the violence will spill over, and they will personally be victims of it, as we've seen in Nepal. Ministers being physically assaulted. In one case, the wife of one minister was burned. That's horrible. No one should condone that. But that sort of corruption and blindness to people's struggles will breed deep anger. And we see this in world history, going right back to the French Revolution and beyond. That sort of thing, it just creates a festering situation that will explode at some point. And young people, we've seen it in Hong Kong, we've seen it in Nepal and elsewhere, are very vocal, understandably, because it's their future. What I would say, though, and this is not for me to dictate, this is entirely up to the people of Nepal, what their future would be, but I would say, okay, you burn government buildings down, you burn cars, etc. What happens next? Because it's all very well to vent anger, but they have created this overturn, they've created the collapse of the government, so, and that might well be justifiable, but what happens next? I think there definitely would need to be an inquiry, and there needs to be new laws brought in about corruption to hold ministers to account. And I think after what's happened, hopefully ministers in Nepal will be a lot more responsible and a lot more in tune with their people, so this doesn't happen again. If you're Nepalese, let me know your thoughts. What do you think is going to happen next? Also, you might say, some people might say you're an outsider, don't have an opinion on this, but Nepal relies on tourism. And for any country to go forward, it needs foreign investment. Now, foreign investors might be jittery about investing in a country that looks unstable. So it's very important to have stability. It's good that the violence has subsided, but 72 people have died, hundreds more have been injured. So, there's going to have to be inquiries also into the precise causes of each of those deaths. And violence cannot be the way forward. In the case of Nepal, I know a little bit about Nepalese history. The context of monarchy and republicanism is a very big issue in Nepalese politics. There was also protests this year to bring back the monarchy. I don't know how popular those are. So if you're Nepalese, what's your thoughts on that? Should the monarchy be brought back? Nepal also went through a very bloody civil war, which ended in 2006. And I'm sure no one wants to see a return to that sort of situation. Although that had more specific context. That was in part a Maoist rebels against the government, so there was other factors involved in that. So yeah, this is a situation that is going to happen elsewhere, unfortunately. I wonder about China. This thing about Nepo babies. In China, for a communist government on paper, there's a hell of a lot of materialism amongst China's elite. And I know that there's anger amongst the general Chinese population about the sons and daughters of Communist Party governors, Politburo members, etc. There was one case in Beijing some years ago where the son of a CCP official knocked down someone in Beijing. I think the person actually died. He basically got away with it. That's the sort of thing that could breed anger. Now, in the case of China, it's just a totalitarian state. It's a single party dictatorship. So protests are extremely rare. When they do happen, they're covered up by state media. And it's one strength that the Chinese Communist Party has. I'm not saying a moral strength. I think it's a rotten regime. But I mean, one, card that they've got is that they do control the media. So it's difficult in China for protests to spread because it's a huge country, unlike Nepal, unlike Sri Lanka, unlike Bangladesh. So if a protest happens in one province, another province thousands of kilometres away might not even know about it. I remember when I was there was an earthquake in, I believe it was in, let me get this right, I think it was Qinghai province, and there was barely any news about it where I was, which was in Guizhou province, even though it was neighbouring. There was also a vehicle attack around that time in which quite a number of people were killed. If that was in the United States or Europe, that would be a huge story. When I was there, it had immediately been taken off like an hour later, even though dozens of people had been killed, and the survivors and the people in the vicinity of the incident were furious. There was also a fire during the COVID lockdown in, I forget the city now, I believe it was somewhere in the west, which is underdeveloped, and a lot of people died, and there was real anger on the streets. There was riots, but again, the news got suppressed. I kind of understand it. If I was Xi Jinping, I wouldn't want to see the sort of scenes that have happened in Kathmandu and Dhaka and Colombo to happen across China, but they can do something about that. They can stop being so damn tyrannical and respect human rights more and deal with corruption. When Xi Jinping came to power, he spoke about cutting down on corruption, but I'm not convinced that has really happened. There's still that sort of Nepo culture going on among Communist Party officials in China. So I'm not sure that it's really been effective. Okay, I'll wrap it up. But this will definitely happen elsewhere, unfortunately. We may see this in Metro Manila in the near future. I hope it doesn't happen. I love the Philippines. I don't want to see that sort of violence in the Philippines. But, corruption is not something that can be ignored because it festers and festers and then it just explodes. In the case of Nepal, the ban on social media was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But it wasn't the main thing. It was just one thing too many. I'll put a link to the Sky News report. Let me know your thoughts, especially if you're Nepalese. What happens next?